Good evening and welcome to Redwood Wonk. My name is Aaron Donaldson, sitting in for Eric Kirk. Joining me this week is David Frank. David, welcome to the show. Good to see you.
Right on. Well, thank you. It's great working with you. I'm glad we're here together. I'm sure it's gonna be fun.
Yeah, we're here to talk about the news of the day. As always on the show, we've got three segments we're going to talk about. We've got a big legal roundup, just a whole bunch of news for the GOP we'll talk about. Then we're going to turn our attention to Joe Biden and the border, in particular, the Title 42 reform. Last, we want to talk about the same thing everybody's talking about, which is the Supreme Court, Justice Thomas, Ginny Thomas. Some are calling them ethics concerns. Some are using the word corruption. And we'll dig into some of this when we get to that third segment. But first, let's turn our attention to the legal roundup for the GOP. Just three really big bits of news going on here. Obviously, George Santos has been in the news for a long time on the comedy shows, but also on the front page of the New York Times, just making up a whole bunch of stuff about where he's from and what his name is and all sorts of other colorful details about his past. Well, that has caught up to him now, and he was, in fact, indicted by, I'm not sure, was it the feds, Dave? Do you know who indicted? Yeah, it was the federal indictment coming his way, and he's going to have to explain a whole lot of this. At the very same time, former president and current GOP frontrunner candidate Donald J. Trump was found guilty and has to pay $5 million. He was guilty of defamation. He was guilty of battery, I think. I don't have the
assault,
exact.
I think it was a sexual assault. Yeah.
There we go. Right. That verdict was coming down. And then recently we have heard that several leaders of the so-called Proud Boys organization were convicted of sedition and conspiracy charges, which are just as extreme as they sound. These are charges that we don't hear a lot in the news. They are related to the January 6th, insurrection that we saw there. David, those are a whole lot of stories all hovering on the GOP. There's obviously a talking point that the Biden administration and the Democrats are weaponizing the law. But at the same time, these are all very illegal things that have gone through the courts in very independent ways. And I just kind of want to get your take on any one of them or kind of all of them. Like, what are your thoughts?
Right on. Well, so the big picture, I was in Florida recently, and so I had an opportunity to speak to conservatives a lot in the last month, and I can tell you that your sort of spidey sense about the fact that the weaponization of the justice system, that seems to be like a sort of a default in-group, out-group kind of protection defense mechanism. It's like an impulse, a reflex. But like you said, these are each independent crimes on their own rights. And overall, I think my big takeaway for the big picture is, actions and words have consequences. And so all three of these groups, we could talk about them each independently. We'll start with George Santos because that's like kind of the one that's a little bit less consequential to each of our daily lives, I would argue. But so George Santos, obviously he's known as somebody who, it's documented. There's tons of evidence of various versions of stretching the truth, lying, sort of just false representations. But worse, he actually was using those false representations in the process of running for federal office and spending money and saying he's raising money for one reason and using it for another. They kind of, to a certain extent, they threw the book at him. I don't have the list of all the charges against him, but it's a pretty big list, and it covers sort of many activities. And so the idea is that why does it matter to us? Well, Speaker of the House McCarthy has said, hey, look, we're not going to punish this guy yet. We're going to wait until he's indicted. Well, now that he's indicted, the response is, well, let's let the judicial system run its course. In the House, it's a very tight count, and they need every vote they can get. Plus, George Santos, I think he's been kind of currying favor with the more right-leaning folks like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene. And so he's part of that kind of rebel wing that put a lot of pressure on McCarthy to even make him speaker in the first place. So he's kind of tied himself to some of these obligations that McCarthy has. So I think McCarthy, the right thing to do eventually would be for the House to probably, eject him from the House once he's finally either pled guilty, which will probably happen, because it's just he's not going to want to go to jail for an extended period of time, or if he's found guilty. And that's, I don't know. I don't have any inside knowledge about whether he'll plea or not, but he's done a lot of illegal things that are sort of kind of on their face. There's evidence. They know that, the legal system's going to have to play out, but I think everything's kind of catching up with him, and that's the kind of an easy one. I don't know if you have more comments on him in particular, if we should pivot to Trump.
All I would say to wrap it up is just that I do think a lot of people are surprised that you can absolutely lie to your constituents and get elected, and that is allowed. That's totally fine. And everyone's like, well, the constituents have to figure this one out. But you cannot lie about where the money is coming from that you are using to get elected. That is something that has a fairly strict legal code, and that is where he's going to find himself in a whole bunch of hot water. In similar amounts of hot water. More to come, I think most people say. But this first one is significant. Former U.S. president found guilty. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so this one I think is really interesting for several reasons. One is the more trouble Trump gets in, the more popular he gets. So right. we have talked, I think you and I, and on this show and elsewhere, we've talked about how social psychology is how our brain maps information. And when the leader of a party is targeted, people in that party take it as a personal attack on themselves, and they kind of double down and provide additional support that's a little bit beyond reason and rationality. And so, you can't really hold it necessarily. I mean, you can, but I personally don't hold it against folks who are kind of circling the wagons and saying, oh, they're going after our guy, because I think it's a natural tendency. But that said, the legal analysis I heard on this one I thought was really interesting. Leading up to the decision, the day before, when they were giving final arguments, the prosecutor said, this person, don't think of him as the former president, he's a person, this individual said, I can do this because I'm, a star. Stars do this. His own words said that he does that kind of thing. And this is a case of sort of I forgot the legal term off the top of my head, but when two people have no witnesses and it's one person's story versus another person's story, it's just how they testify. It's a testimonial. And so you've got one testimonial and credibility versus another testimonial and credibility. And in this case, Trump's own words testified against him. He said, people like me can do this and get away with it. And he basically laughed about it.
Fortunately or unfortunately, I believe were his words. He says, throughout time, stars can do this. And then he says, fortunately or unfortunately. It's amazing how explicit he is.
Yeah. And he always says that, like when he talks, not always, there's many occasions where he's kind of saying both sides of the thing out loud, and he's like framing the issue, and he's kind of saying, many people say this, some people say it, no one said it, like he just kind of goes off in these riffs. But self-culpability has reared its head here, because the jury didn't wait very long. They knew who they believed. And then so the question is, well, what's the consequence? Maybe he'll appeal. Maybe he won't have to pay quite so much money. The $5 million I don't think is the important part. The important part is what's going to be the outcome. And electorally, will it hurt him? Probably not. The same people that supported him the day before supported him even a little bit more the day after, probably. So that's not a thing.
It can't help him, though, right? Sorry to interrupt you, but it definitely isn't going to help him in any capacity.
No. Because half the country is women, and at least some significant portion of women are like, this is not good. Like you'd have to expect that. That's going to hurt that population. Plus, there's thoughtful people, and there are people that don't want to, elect people that are engaged in that kind of behavior. So yeah, it can be reductive too. But I think the question, a lot of people. So this is the key thing here. I think a lot of folks wanted some judicial outcome to prevent him from, so some rule would pop up and say, oh, he's ineligible to be president. He's out of the box. He can't run. He's going to run no matter what. And especially that he's very popular right now. And I say no matter what with one asterisk. Congress can act. Congress has the ability to disqualify people from office based on like the impeachment process, et cetera. One of the punishments could have been an ineligibility punishment. twice they didn't go that route. At some point, if he's found guilty of many crimes, this would just be like, stones in the jar. Could it reach the point where the Republicans can reach the water? I don't think so. I think they're going to let this thing roll, and I can't honestly say why, but that's what seems to be happening. It seems like we have a Trump Biden redo ahead of us.
Kind of like with the Santos note that we made, where you can lie to your constituents and get elected, and that's allowed. Donald Trump can run for president from jail. He can run for president from in all sorts of legal circumstances, and he can get elected in those circumstances. There's only a few routes whereby he would be prohibited from serving as the president were he to win an election. It's fascinating to me that the reaction here is that it isn't going to hurt him too bad. He's going to keep most of his base and things like that. The idea that a former president has been convicted is not lost on most people. I think we're just kind of expecting a drumbeat of this note in the future. There are bigger, more consequential investigations where the evidence is just as significant, if not more so. Do you think this is true? Do you think that Trump, being Trump, is able to kind of downplay the historic note that we're seeing here? He's running on it. He's definitely not downplaying it. He is running on it. But I think what is interesting to me is that it just sounds like more like politics as usual, just like America is always going to take everything and turn it into the horse race politics point. This is significant. A former president was convicted by a jury in court. I mean, that's major.
So we're going to talk about conspiracy when we talk about the next set of crimes that came down, and I think that there's a conspiracy conviction in his future. He's got a date with destiny. That's the kind of thing that I don't think that that the political powers that be within the Republican Party, if it's finally adjudicated that there was a conspiracy, that he was at the hub and spoke of all the pieces, whether it's Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, like the attempt to overturn the election and disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. If that all plays out as a federal crime, that's the kind of crime I think that could really derail him. But other than that, if he's playing the victim, singing the same song and walking the same walk, and it's one of those things where I just don't see a Republican challenger yet that has the charisma and the path that to break the base in that direction.
Thoughts on the sedition and conspiracy charges? I mean, I don't really keep shy about my opinion around here. I read it and I thought exactly right and good riddance. I'm curious what your take was on that.
Yeah, so with the Proud Boys thing, and I don't mean to project onto them things that may have gotten mixed signals. I say they, like it's all a bunch, like it's one thing, but there are a whole bunch of folks who showed up on January 6th that had messaged electronically and made certain strategic plans accordingly, like the Oath Keepers. And so they have their own set of issues, which we're not going to get into today. Proud Boys was a little different. It was more of like a club of braggadocio and bravado, and even Trump during one of the debates, Proud Boys, stand down and stand by. Like, he liked the idea that he had some kind of shock troops, militia guys in the street. Not entirely unlike, I hate to say it, but that's Hitler. When Hitler came to power, it was because he was able to win bar fights. His followers were winning bar fights across the country, and sort of that ground-based macho imagery that his party was able to project sort of in the streets, so to speak. That's kind of what the role that Proud Boys played. I did see a little bit about these guys where the guy would say, the leader, I forgot his name off the top of my head, but he would say, like, I don't drink, and then he would have a bottle of like scotch behind him, and then he would later on you'd see that he was probably pretty drunk, and then he would say, like, we are a t-shirt, we're a money raising entity so that we can buy Ferraris and be guys, and there's just not a whole lot that of political thoughtfulness there. It wasn't like it was we're going to take over the Capitol. It was more just like a guys club that, what I said earlier in this segment was words have consequences. And there's just enough of a track record of them just kind of, just being, you could say it's guys being guys, but it's not that. It's again, it's sort of a flirting with violence, flirting with like Trump's our guy and we got his back, and I don't think they were ever going to like seditiously overturn the government, but they wanted to play a role. They felt really good about playing a role because Trump spoke to them, and they enjoyed being at the sort of the front line of the party, and now it's caught up to them.
There's been a real flippancy and a real glib nature that has come with Trumpism. And you see it before the election even begins, with Trump himself promising that if he wins, it'll be a landslide, and if he loses, it'll be stolen, and that he's going to get reelected forever and ever and ever. That there is, really no legitimate kind of leadership that isn't Donald Trump himself. And there has been, as you said, a kind of braggadocio, an arrogance, a flippancy. And by and large, that's not new to American politics. And again, here we're going to say, as much as you don't like it, it's not necessarily anti-democratic. That's the muck of democracy. It's not illegal. But what is illegal, again, is to take that flippancy and that arrogancy and to target a bona fide election and to target a sitting United States Congress. And I think what it shows, and I really like the kind of nuance in your answer, David, with regards to kind of parsing these individuals apart from some of the more explicit narratives that we saw in terms of what was happening on that day. But what ultimately it goes to show is that there may have been people that were there to just kind of, quote, tour the Capitol, to use the misframing that we're seeing a lot from the right. That might have been their impression. But the narrative and the organization, and in fact, the explicit purpose of that organization on that day, meeting in that building, the time of day that it met, was to interrupt an election.
Yeah.
And I think that there has to be consequences for that. It's the kind of thing where it doesn't have to be the most extreme instances for us to say, no, this is a vulnerable part of our democracy, and we're going to try to find some kind of enforcement mechanism to protect it. So we're going to turn our attention now to Joe Biden and the border. Obviously, Joe Biden has launched his reelection campaign. It may seem like a secret, but it's not. He's running for reelection. And a lot of people are saying that the economy is going to be one of the big things that he's going to have to shake. He's got a showdown on the debt limit and all of that that's going to have major impacts on his ability to be reelected. However, the border has to be another one that he's facing, that a lot of people are facing, that could have some major consequence. And it is in part because Title 42, which is predicated on the 1944 Public Health Service Act, which was enacted during the COVID-19 pandemic. Title 42 is set to expire. And essentially what this means is it gives the United States the ability to kind of reject asylum seekers based on the concerns of, some kind of pandemic or health emergency or something like that. And in Biden's own words, it's going to be fairly chaotic because this is going to drastically increase the number of people now that could not just be summarily rejected at the border, And we are facing large, influxes of immigrant populations. This definitely picked up during the Trump administration and has continued into the Biden administration. And just for a little bit of context, if I might, the BBC did a great summary in 2020 where it kind of talked about the situation that Biden was left with and dispelled some myths about the Trump administration. Donald Trump did not necessarily deport more people than Barack Obama or even Joe Biden has during his administration. Trump was not a big deportation person. That was his rhetoric, but that's not what he did. What he did do was invite quite a bit more temporary workers into the country. So he brought a lot more temporary folks here into the country. Frequently, those people have families. And when those workers come to the country and then their families want to join them in the country, that's going to lead to an influx of certain types of populations that are coming across the border. And the BBC kind of explained how the temporary work policies that the Trump administration really increased. If you want to talk about a president that increased the number of immigrants in this country, the BBC says Trump did that with these policies. That changes the influx of who is coming and going. The detainment went way up. The detainment almost doubled in 2019, and this was driven in large part, the numbers show us, by the detention of families, particularly young folks, but also folks that would not normally have been detained. They would have been allowed to live in other kinds of places. So they're not deporting these people. They are bringing them here temporarily. Then they are detaining them. The last thing that we see in this report is that the Trump administration left the Biden administration with a huge increase in sympathy for immigrants and a rise in the American public wanting to see immigration policies that are more humane. So far, the Biden administration has not really fulfilled that, in part because of their own policies, but also because of the courts that have denied them the Title 42 repeal a couple of times. Real quick, the last thing that I'm going to say on this is that his negotiation is to try to limit the number of people that are coming based on asylum, to continue to reject people that are seeking asylum that enter the country illegally, but to try to increase the number of legal paths, so-called legal paths, to come into this country. This is a policy that he thinks is going to work, but he thinks it will be fairly chaotic. He's taken it from both sides on this. I don't see this getting any better. What are your thoughts, David? What's Biden's future on this immigration problem?
Yeah, so it's a really complex issue, and I think that when we focus just on what's right in front of us, as mainstream media tends to do, we see it as a chaos looming tomorrow, right? Because tomorrow is the day that Title 42 is gone. But when you look back over the last, say, 4 months or so, the administration is aware that there has been very little progress on reforming immigration rules. So there's been a couple of different factors that I think have been put in place. Like, for example, they want to try to prevent this potential exodus. So they're actually put in place a few different ways to make it a little bit harder for asylum seekers to get here, to get their fair hearing. Which in reality, that's the sort of elephant in the room, is that if you are truly persecuted in your country, then you're entitled to an asylum hearing, and chances are you're actually entitled to stay under some proscribed circumstances. So what they've tried to do is, rather knowing that they're not there's no political traction to adequately staffing the asylum process. Eric and I covered this pretty recently, where at one point it was like 3 years behind, and their goal is to be able to process people within 30 days. So there's a big disconnect between 999 and 30. But one of the things that they're doing is they've developed a system where they're saying, okay, if you are from countries where you would ordinarily be entitled to asylum, but you go to Mexico first, you're no longer going to be eligible for asylum. That to me seems probably illegal, but we'll see how that plays out. And what I mean by that is it's not consistent with the law. Asylum is asylum is asylum. It doesn't matter where you came from. They're just trying to scare people away from, and rightfully so, tell people don't just walk through Mexico to come here. Discouraging that makes sense, but having a policy of claiming that they'll be ineligible, I think that's not right. But we have seen a pretty big shift. I think the number is 2.8 million people so far have been expelled under Title 42. I don't know if you covered that or not. I'm sorry if I missed it, but it's a pretty big number. And what I saw was that since March of 3 years ago, so in the last 3 years, about 64% of 2 out of 3 adults have been expelled. So it's not small. I mean, it's literally like a virtual wall. If you're here, you're bounced. Whereas families, it's only like a quarter or less. Closer to 1 in 5, 1 in 4. So people that are coming over as families, at least there's this humanitarian understanding that it's no longer, well, maybe during the Trump administration it was okay, but we no longer want to break up families. There was one really interesting statistic explanation. I have to give full credit to Washington Office on Latin America. Immense amount of data. I was only able to skim through it, so it hasn't really sunk in all the lessons that were there. But one of the key things that they say is that really, when we talk about cause, people say, oh, the cause is because Biden is weak on immigration. You hear Republicans say that. The cause is because after the pandemic and the economic instability that was made that much worse, not just here, but in all of Latin America, there's actual physical insecurity. Latin America makes up less than 10% of the world's population, but it is a third of all the world's homicides. So it's just a very violent region, and that's in part because of organized crime. And so these are countries that need major interventions and economic development. But climate change and natural disasters are also a huge driving force. Political unrest and persecution. So not just the economy being exploitative and violent and like you would expect with gang violence, but it's also coming from the governments themselves. So the governments are using violence to combat violence. And when you fight fire with fire, it makes you an arsonist. And then finally, there's actual country-specific humanitarian crises. So this organization points out that Cuba, Haiti, and Venezuela in particular are just devastated for lots of reasons. But from a humanitarian perspective, these are places where basically everybody would be entitled to asylum. So that's a reality that requires major interventions of a political nature, which is another conversation. So, and then finally, family reunification. There's a lot of these residents of our country that are legal here from Latin America, and they just want to come to be with their family, and they figure if they just walk here and push their way across the border, they'll have a better chance than waiting through the paperwork. So again, a major investment in processing paperwork to reunify families, which is actually a conservative principle. If you really do support families and know that they'll thrive better when they're together, or more likely to thrive anyway, then why not have all the family reunification efforts that make a lot of sense? And so we can talk more about it, but the truth is, it's a very complicated issue that often gets boiled down to sound bites and talking points, and it just it doesn't do anybody any good. And unfortunately, one last thing, sorry, the military has been mobilized. There's 1,500 troops right now, and that's to aid in Customs Border Patrol in doing their job. But the idea is that we could, I've said it all along, if you at all believe there should be a wall, you should believe in a virtual wall. You should believe in using high tech and tracking people and keeping people safe and kind of splitting them off from the gangs and the traffickers that are harming them and committing atrocities on the people. The desperation that's there, and the fact that our military is starting to get involved, there could be a ramp up, and it could add to safety. It could add to stability there and eliminate some of the chaos. And unfortunately, I wish it didn't come to this. We could be looking at, instead of this massive spike, it could just be more of the same because we already have a crisis.
As a political football, I think it's really ironic and obviously very tragic. The Republican talking point is that this is more of like the quote lawless Biden open border administration. which, again, the reason I gave that context at the top is to say that Donald Trump had, in many ways, a far more accessible policy as far as temporary work permits to come to the United States, just to bring people here in a very short term with, very little support after that, as with the exception of potential detention, which is for both political parties a major financial driving base. The prison industrial complex contributes to the Democrats, contributes to the Republicans. It's kind of a central fundraising pillar of both parties, which means that when it comes to detention, there's a very sick financial incentive for the political parties to not move away from those policies. I think that when you mention the driving forces behind this, as I'm sure you're aware, it's really important too to take a look at the histories of these economies and the histories of these governments, specifically when you're looking at Cuba and Venezuela and Haiti, and we would add Colombia and Guatemala. There are so many examples where when you look at these nations and when you look at the violence, when you look at the corruption, and when you look at the political instability and you read the history, you see corporations, you see the American military, you see the two working frequently in tandem to kind of destabilize regions that aren't playing by the rules that we like. And here there are extreme consequences that are being driven by climate change. That do create very, very disparate groups of vulnerable populations. And I think, just as someone who does study the ways that we talk about immigration, when we use metaphors like waves and tides and surges of immigrants, we really neglect the vulnerability of these populations and also just the sheer economic clout that they carry with them. If they're able to make the extreme journeys and to do the kinds of huge planning and organizing and toughing it out that comes with moving to the United States from these places, what we find is that they're far less likely to commit crime. They work really, really hard, and that's why they're coming. Otto Santa Anna has a great book called Brown Tide Rising, where he kind of talks about all of the metaphors that we use to describe immigration from the so-called global South, and how it really not only robs people of their dignity, but also just on the economic scale, it robs Americans of a really sizable economic boon. I say frequently on this show, China wishes they had the immigration problem that the United States has. A lot of countries wish they had that immigration problem. If you don't treat it as an invasion or a caravan or indeed even chaos, if you try to find more humane ways to deal with this problem, there's a lot to be gained there. And I think, the kind of note that I want to make here at the end is that we're not seeing that from either political party. It seems to be dead on arrival in Congress, at least. I don't see any traction on any reform, with the exception, as you say, just kind of more business as usual. That's fair to say, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And like I said, people that get into the weeds on immigration policy, they're a lot of smart people work on this. There are ways to stay compliant with U.S. and international law that honors the asylum process. And not everybody is gonna qualify for asylum, but the practice I think to date is that about half of all people that apply for asylum get it. So it's not like we're talking about some small percentage of these, whatever that was, 2.8 million people. We're still talking about, again, we are in violation if we send them back without a hearing. But we got 2 million people in queue for hearings, or just short of that, 1.8 million. There's only 600 or 650 judges or so. So we have a backlog of 5 years. And so how are we going to handle it? We handle it like a video game of Breakout or whatever, or Risk or War or something. And, that's what we're not going to, it's not humane. But instead, like the way we treat Ukrainian migrants and the way we treat Afghani migrants, we allow them a 90-day grace period to come here, get a temporary work permit till they get a hearing. Hopefully that they'll end up with a permanent work documentation. Because those are countries we've chosen, that they're special, and maybe that's justified. I have a personal connection to people in both countries, so I tend to think they need our help. But We also have personal connections to people in Latin America too, and so temporary work visas. There was a process for many generations of people going back and forth, of living in the South and coming here for work and then going back. And so if there was a rational temporary work permit system, that's one way to do it. Just more pragmatically, though, if you talk from a small business perspective, large business perspective, you talk to the agribusiness about their labor needs. They are up against it if they don't have access to Latin American workers, and it affects the price of food. It's a really big deal. So we are irrationally not taking into account the well-being of the people, the well-being of our own country, and just our own commitments to international law and just common human dignity and decency.
Immigrants are kind of an inevitable part of human activity. They're doctors, they're researchers, they're farm workers, they're the backbone of our society. And we have a choice. We can make them criminals or we can make them taxpayers. And it seems we're choosing the former and not the latter.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, William Jefferson Clinton, do solemnly swear.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear. So help me God.
Moving now finally to the Supreme Court, it has been just a bombshell of a couple of weeks here, just with regards to everything that we're learning to the revelations of the revelations of Justice Clarence Thomas and all of the kinds of unreported contributions that he is getting from various parties, to the revelations that the Washington Post has reported very recently, close to $600,000 or something like that were funneled through Ginny Thomas to conservative organizations. It is absolutely no secret that Ginny Thomas is self-employed as a so-called political operative or lobbyist or whatever you want to call the work that she does to kind of try to organize political causes, which in many ways is her right as a democratic citizen in this country. But when it comes to the role that she plays as the spouse of a sitting justice of the Supreme Court, it creates a situation where, ethics violations are potentially too soft of a term. I think a lot of people are using this question of whether or not we have to have ethics interrogations into the Supreme Court, while other people are saying there are some very, very explicit connections that can be made with regards to the folks that are giving money through these organizations to the cases that Chief Justice Thomas is then turning around and listening to the appointment of folks like Amy Coney Barrett and on and on and on. I will say the only other thing that I will say about this is that Frontline does have a incredible 2-hour. I'm going to keep saying Chief Justice Thomas because I just read the response from Chief Justice Roberts, and it's not good enough, is what I should say right now. Chief Justice Roberts has said that there was this kind of secretive update to their ethics and principles policy that had very little transparency, so far as anyone can tell, and that has left the House Democrats, at least, and the Democrats in general, saying that there's just more to be desired. This is a question that really needs an answer. The other bit of context that's worth noting is that confidence in the eyes of the American public is at a historic low. This is something that is not lost on Chief Justice Roberts. It dropped from 36% to 25%, according to Gallup, confidence in the Supreme Court. That was as a result of the repeal of Roe v. Wade. We also see dips as a result of Mitch McConnell's what many people would call stealing of a Supreme Court justice seat. He didn't break any laws, just refused for the first time in history to seat a nominated individual, and that gave Trump an incredible opportunity to put a lot of conservatives on the court, and that left a lot of Democrats and liberals feeling alienated, and the court does not speak for them. So there is an absolute crisis right now in whether or not the American public views the court as a reasonable organ of power. The questions about oversight on the court are huge right now. David, what's your reaction with regards to, we could talk generally about the whole thing, but the Washington Post article in particular seems to suggest that Ginny Thomas's role is going to be even more prevalent. Like, I can't imagine this is the only thing that we're going to hear about her. What was your take on that article?
Well, unfortunately, I didn't read it, even though I do read the Washington Post regularly.
Right.
I check it out on the almost every day. I'm skimming through it, and I didn't catch this one, so I apologize.
Didn't mean to set you up for failure.
That's
You're
okay.
typically
That's okay.
on with it. So.
But yeah, hey, I'll be resilient here. The truth is that with 2024 coming up and Ginny Thomas being the one who has the ear of Donald Trump's chief of staff by text during the insurrection itself, the January 6th events, the whatever you want to call it, the display of freedom, whatever people want to call it. She's front and center in the enterprise with no remorse, and one step closer to our topic at hand here. Obviously, Clarence Thomas has no remorse about his relationship with billionaire funder of his, friend of his. I think the bigger, for me, the just to acknowledge what you were saying is it's going to get worse before it gets better, because this court is of history will look back. This is an activist court. It's a radical court. It's just that they're not radically left. They're not radically bending towards liberty and freedom and undermining the power of monopoly and oligarchy, like started to happen when laissez-faire, when the court sort of shifted back in the early 20th century. Business ruled the day, and there would be laws passed that would say hey, you can't harm your workers, and the Supreme Court would say, nope, the legislature doesn't have the power to put in place a rule that tells business what to do. Sorry, unconstitutional. So there are times when the court is making decisions that are wrong for an extended period of time. In legal principles, they are sticking to a socioeconomic philosophy, and that's history. You can look this up. This is the evolution of our courts. We are in a period now where it's a similar philosophy. We're not going to get into the details here, but it's not just overturning Roe v. Wade, which was principle, 50 years, the stare decisis concept of letting this decision stand. They're radically changing many different things consistent with the Federalist Society principles. These judges were put in place, not just these Supreme Court justices, but many of the federal judges were recruited because of their sort of party line adherence to judicial philosophies. Again, it's a little bit out of scope for what we're talking about, but the truth is that it's a contest. It's a challenge of wills here, and in this context, for the court to have no ethical standard whatsoever, other than the voluntary one that Justice Roberts said, hey, it's a voluntary system, we're good. But evidence is that they're not good. And we know that. And so really by him coming out and saying, you know what, Dick Durbin, Senator Durbin, the court doesn't need to go talk to Congress. We don't need to be browbeaten by you.
He said it would violate the separation of powers. Right.
Yeah, so it's okay for the court to tell Congress, you know what, you don't have the right to make that law to put an 8-hour workday in or for child labor. That's their job. Their job is to tell Congress when Congress overreaches. It's also Congress's job, I think, to tell the courts when they overreach. And so in this case, my prediction last week, not to cut to the conclusion right away, but my prediction last week was that this is such a crisis of confidence because of their actions. Again, words have consequences, deeds have consequences. There is already an ethical standard in place for every federal judge in the country, except this body. And so they will have to adopt a code of conduct at some point. It's pretty obvious to rational thinking people. The question is, are they going to do it voluntarily, or is it going to come from Congress? I suspect they'll figure it out on their own, but they're just not there yet. One thing I want to add here too is that we are talking about people are saying that this is a smokescreen, that, oh, you're targeting Clarence Thomas, Ginny Thomas, you're targeting Chief Justice Roberts' wife and her $10 million of legal recruitment that she's been able to get a pretty good gig going, that you're targeting them because they're Republican or because you disagree with them, because you want a more radical response to this court, which is to pack the court or to have more than one court. They only hear a small percentage of the cases that come in front of them. That in and of itself, that agenda setting is political in nature. They get to decide which cases they're just going to let stand. And so almost by omission, by having a small docket, by deciding what agenda setting items they're going to do, that's overtly political too, unfortunately. So packing the court in a way that says, you know what, we could have 5 regional Supreme Courts, and we could take 5 times more cases. That's consistent with democracy, because there will be more justice, and they don't want that. They don't want that at all. Now, I've said before, the philosopher king is supposed to be above the fray. In Plato, the philosopher king is the highest part of the republic. The republic is based on these wise people acting out of the altruism. We don't have wise people acting out of altruism. Nobody has ever said that what they're doing is altruistic, and it wasn't that way in the 20th century, and it wasn't that way in the 18th century. Many of these cases are flawed people, and we're just now reminded that they're flawed and that their lack of popularity probably is justified.
One of the most alarming things, I think, and that really strikes to the heart of this issue, is just a lack of accountability and the lack of access that the public feels just generally that they have when it comes to the Supreme Court. Obviously, we do not vote for the justices on the Supreme Court. It has to be a vacancy that crops up because one retires or dies, and then the sitting president, whoever that might be, is going to appoint a justice. And if you take a look at the last couple of justices, there's been a remarkable trend to the right, not exclusively because of Mitch McConnell, but with a body of 9 people, 1 vote is a pretty significant move. And when you look at the ages of the individuals involved, these are generational choices that are being made. And I think that more and more, especially with decisions like the, Dodd's decision, but also with regards to just stuff that we're seeing for climate change, for technology. A lot of these decisions do not track with the public opinion. With firearms, I think the 2008 Heller decision, the 2010 McDonald v. Chicago decision, like these are good examples of decisions that just do not track in many ways with versions of our history, but definitely with the public opinion. And there's nothing that we can do. We can't vote for a new justice. We can't impeach a justice. You can't, remove a justice. And when it comes time for them to follow just basic ethical principles that literally every other judge in the country have to follow, they get to decide if they're going to do that. We have to appeal to the better nature of the Chief Justice, and he will hem and haw on it. And eventually, that is not helping. I feel like Roberts is, many people are saying there's this kind of moderating effect that Trumpism has had on Chief Justice Roberts, and I'm just not seeing it. What I'm seeing is someone that wants to keep the court exactly the way that it was 5 years ago, and he wants to just kind of pretend that it's this magical body that no one has any problem with, or that may be unpopular, but that's what the Constitution is going to have to require. And I just don't think that that's the reality that Americans want. I perk up every time you talk about packing the courts, David, because I think it is something that alarms a lot of people, but it is not ahistoric. It is deeply democratic. And if you just care at all about the trend of the court, just again, look at the last several justices that have been appointed. Take a look at who has been in power in terms of the popular vote and what they have won and things like that. It's a body that's losing a lot of the faith that the public puts in it. And this is, just a kind of another note to make on this is there are people out there that say whether the public believes in the court doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, it's just up to the law. The law determines what the court would say and appoints that in terms of how they argue their legal principles and things. But I think that when it comes to the faith that the public puts into the court and into the law, this has a huge impact on just how connected we are to just like the laws that we have. I think when we feel like something as important as abortion rights are ripped away from so many Americans, that has a huge legal ramification. But at the same time, it is very destabilizing just to the idea of what the American democratic experience is all about. And I don't know that I can really explain the consequences of that, but that seems just as significant. I feel like Roberts is missing an opportunity to do more. And I think the Democrats are too. I don't hear anyone talking about packing the court, but I agree with you. It would be fascinating. The regional court idea especially would be an interesting one.
Yeah, and two things come to mind when you say that. Firstly, I say those things. There's 95 district courts and 12 appellate districts, I believe that's right, approximately. Anyway, why just one Supreme? There's no real reason for it. It's just an accident of history. And so when people say, look, I'm a strict constructionist, I want to follow the Constitution, this 200-plus-year-old document, every time, the way our system works, every time a judge has a finding, it's adding to the Constitution. All the decisions are additive to the Constitution. So strict constructionalism is arbitrary in its own right.
And the Constitution determines how we make up the court. I'm pretty sure the Constitution is the part that says that the Congress can determine how many people are in the court. So
exactly.
Let's put it to work.
and I know we just have a couple minutes left, and maybe you and I will do a show on this, but on this topic, because there's a lot here. But people think it's like a function box, that like judges apply the law like a function, like it's automatic, like the law is like the Napoleonic Code, I think it's called, where the laws in France specify everything. There's no limited interpretation. We're the opposite. We have principles, and every unique situation gets its own unique kind of review. This court has, like you said, whether it comes to regulation, whether it comes to the separation of church and state, this is the court that said, well, that separation of church and state, that's a legal principle that's outside the scope. It's not actually law. It's an agreement, and so it's a principle that was in place in the 1860s or something, that they don't want to give much merit to, and so when they have findings in, like, Eric and I have talked about cases in Montana and cases in Maine where the court's like, yeah, there's no such thing as the separation of church and state. That's a letter that someone liked. Some states put it into their constitution, but it's optional. It's not a thing. It's not something they need to. So they don't. Like, this court does not acknowledge that that's a thing. Just like they don't acknowledge that that right to privacy is as rich and robust as it's sort of played out over the last 5 decades. So knowing that they're willing to be this flexible means that it's a challenge it's going to be a challenge that really requires an immense amount of scrutiny going forward to, at the very least, put in an ethical standards.
Seems like a low bar, but here we are hoping that that's what we get.
Eeny, meeny, chili beanie, the spirits are about to speak.
Are they friendly spirits?
Friendly? Just listen.
All right. Well, we're right here at the end of the show. And as always on Redwood Wonk, we're going to end with a couple of predictions. David, what do you got for us?
So people have been talking about how this budget ceiling fight is going to, could potentially result in, making the recession that much worse and have massive harm to the economy. I heard President Biden say recently that Lawrence Tribe, famous constitutional scholar, a professor, told him, as a matter of principle, the 14th Amendment clearly says the budget ceiling is not constitutional, not legit. The full faith and credit of the commitment of the U.S. dollar shall not be infringed. So a commitment that Congress makes must be paid. So the budget ceiling is an arbitrary thing it's unconstitutional. But what Biden said was that if the White House tried to make this challenge now, they would be litigating it long after the crisis hits. So my prediction is that there will be some budget compromise that comes from some degree of cuts it's not going to be a quid pro quo. It's going to be a backroom handshake, but that we will see the budget ceiling disappear because it's anachronistic and arguably unconstitutional.
So the Republicans are going to get budget cuts to lift the ceiling. That's the takeaway.
Yep.
One of them. I think you're right.
Oh, that's two predictions. Actually, you're right. That's right. There's two predictions there. There will be some budget cuts to lift the ceiling. Yes.
I don't want you to be right, but I think you are right.
Thank you.
Another prediction I've made a couple times, and I'm just going to keep making it, and everyone says I'm nuts about it, but I've got just a sneaky feeling. The ad from Liz Cheney dropped just recently, and I think somewhere around the time of the Georgia indictment, she's definitely going to enter the race. And I think she's going to do better than a lot of people think she does. One of the angles that I do not see covered, everyone talks about her approval rating with Republicans. Not good. 66% have an unfavorable opinion of her, something like 13% like her. But I saw one poll that said something like 3 out of 5 Democrats have a favorable opinion of Liz Cheney. And Joe Biden is not a strong candidate. She could be a fascinating so-called centrist candidate. A Cheney is not a centrist. But in this election, she would be a fascinating centrist candidate. And I think that in the debate stage, she would do really, really well. And it would be interesting to see. So that's my prediction, is that sometime around the Georgia indictment, whenever that is, she's going to use that as part of her announcement. And she's going to come out.
I believe that's I think you got your finger on the pulse, my friend.
She's a heck of a candidate. I don't like her, but I do want to see her debate Trump. Well, thanks so much for having a time to sit down and talk to us, David. It's great always to talk to you about politics. I know it's typically you and Eric, but I really do appreciate the opportunity to drop in and chat with you on these issues.
Oh, this has been great. I'm glad we got this chance, and I'm looking forward to more.
Well, thanks you to everyone that has been watching the show. As always, thanks for tuning in to Access Humboldt. Stay informed and stay engaged.